Chapter 9, The Enchanted Ground. Near the base of the mountain, the pilgrims saw a youth stepping onto the king's highway. He had come from the country of deceit along a little crooked lane. This cocksure lad named Ignorance now fell in beside Christian and Hopeful as they headed for the celestial city. After greetings had been exchanged, Christian asked the newcomer, "How can you be sure that you will be received at the celestial gate?" "I live a good life," the young man replied. "I pray, fast, and give away money. I've even left home and country. Yet I am afraid you will be treated like a thief and turned away at the celestial gate because you didn't come on to the way through the wicket gate." Christian said sadly. Ignorance could not agree. "You keep to your opinion and I'll keep to mine," he suggested bluntly. "No one in my country seems to know anything about this wicket gate. Besides, there is a perfectly good green path leading from our country right onto the king's highway." Seeing that Ignorance had for the present closed his mind against them, Christian and Hopeful decided that it would be wisest to leave him alone and give him time to reflect. So for the next part of their journey, they kept well ahead of the youth. Their way lay through a dark lane. Going along this, they were horrified to see a man tied up with 7 strong ropes, being carried by 7 devils towards byway into hell, the place recently visited by Christian and Hopeful. As the group came nearer, Christian thought he recognized the man as Turnaway from Apostasy Town. And as they passed by, Hopeful saw, from the inscription on the bound man's back, that he had once rashly made a profession of faith and was now condemned as a renegade and a deserter. When the devils with their prisoner had disappeared from view, Christian told Hopeful a story he had heard about something that had happened in the dark lane along which they were travelling. "Not long ago," he began, "a man called Little Faith from the town of Sincere came to this lane, but at its entrance, where Dead Man's Lane comes in from Broadway Gate, he sat down and slept. 3 men, brothers in blood and roguery, called Mistrust, Faint Heart, and Guilt, seeing the pilgrim waking from sleep, preparing to move on, shouted, 'Stand still!' Little Faith turned deathly white and obeyed, rigid with fear. 'Give me your purse,' ordered Faint Heart. And when the pilgrim did not immediately comply, Mistrust snatched a bag of silver from the man's pocket. At this, Little Faith plucked up enough courage to shout, 'Thieves! Thieves!' only to receive a stunning blow from Guilt's cudgel. Someone could now be heard approaching the spot. The thieves, afraid that this might turn out to be Great Grace from Good Confidence City, took to their heels, leaving Little Faith on the ground bleeding heavily. Recovering slightly after a time, the wounded man got to his feet and staggered on. "Did the thieves take away everything he owned?" asked Hopeful. "Providentially, they did not find his jewels or his scroll of admission to the celestial city," his companion answered. "His jewels must have been of great comfort to him," commented Hopeful. "Not as great a comfort as they might have been," replied Christian. For from that time onwards, Little Faith was obsessed by his misfortune, speaking and thinking of little else during the rest of his journey. An idea occurred to Hopeful. "Why didn't Little Faith pawn or sell his jewels?" he added brightly. "Why, you birdbrain," retorted his companion, "to whom could he sell them, seeing they were not regarded as valuable in the country through which he was travelling? Besides, and even more to the point, he knew that if he did not present his gems at Celestial City, he would not receive his inheritance there." This sharp response upset Hopeful, who put forward an argument to justify his suggestion. But Christian soundly refuted this, and the younger pilgrim had to admit that his companion was in the right. Then Hopeful, still slightly nettled, demanded, "Why didn't Little Faith pluck up more courage and fight? These 3 rogues were probably cowards at heart." Plenty of people talk like that until they come face to face with them, Christian remarked. And don't forget, these rogues are only trainee thieves, apprenticed to the king of the bottomless pit, and he already stands to come to their aid at any time. He then told Hopeful that he knew all this from first-hand experience, because he had encountered and resisted mistrust, guilt, and faint heart. But they had simply called on their master for help. I found it very hard to hold my own against him. Though I was clad in armour from head to foot, Christian concluded his tale. But they fled at the mere thought of great grace, persisted Hopeful. Ah, yes, Christian agreed, but he is the king's champion, and not every pilgrim is one of those. Little Faith was only a weak pilgrim, and even Great Grace had problems if those rogues managed to come to grips with him. His scarred face tells its own story. My advice is, don't ever wish to meet these thieves, or boast that you would have done far better than those who have faced them. Our task is to wear all our armour, especially the shield of faith, for with it you will be able to put out all the fiery darts of the wicked. All the time they had been talking, ignorance had continued to follow them at a distance. Now the pilgrims came to a path which joined theirs and seemed to be equally straight and true. As they hesitated, a dark man in a white robe came and greeted them. They told him of their predicament, and he responded courteously, "Follow me, for I am going to the celestial city too." Flattered that a guide had apparently been sent to escort them, Christian and Hopeful followed the dark man down the path which joined theirs. For a short time all seemed well, and then suddenly a net enveloped the two pilgrims, trapping them. As this happened, the white robe fell from their guide's shoulders, and they saw who he really was. Too late they remembered the shepherd's warning, "Beware of the flatterer," and the note with directions on it. The flatterer went away, leaving the two men he had led astray, struggling to escape from their rope prison. After a time, exhausted, they lay down and wept. Then they saw a shining one, carrying a small whip, approaching them. First, he tore the net open, released the pilgrims. Then, having ascertained that they had been cautioned and given directions, he punished them for their carelessness and forgetfulness, saying, as he did so, "I rebuke and punish all whom I love. Be in earnest then, and turn away from your sins." Far from resenting this treatment, Christian and Hopeful thanked the Shining One for his kindness. Then they retraced their steps to the right path, proceeded along it, singing for their recent salutary experience. Soon a man coming from the opposite direction met the pilgrims and asked where they were going. "To Mount Zion," they replied. At this answer, the stranger, whose name was Atheist, burst out laughing. "There's no such place as Mount Zion," he sneered. "I have been searching for 20 years and have not found it. So now I am going back to enjoy all the pleasures I denied myself in order to pursue my quest." Christian, looking at Hopeful, asked, "Does this man speak the truth?" "Beware," answered Hopeful at once. "He is one of the flatterers. In any case, didn't we see the gate of Mount Zion city from the Delectable Mountains? And aren't we supposed to be walking by faith towards it?" Then Christian started to smile, delighted by Hopeful's reply, for he had posed the question simply to test his younger companion. At one, in their rejection of Atheist, the pilgrims turned their back on him and walked away. Before long, the man's mocking laughter could be heard no more. The air of the country through which the pilgrims had to travel was noted for its soporific effect. Hopeful could hardly keep his eyes open, suggested that they should take a nap. But Christian reminded him of the shepherd's warning against sleeping on the enchanted ground. In order to keep awake and moving, Hopeful related the story of his past life. "For many years I delighted in the follies of Vanity Fair," he began. "But then I heard, first from others, and later from you and Faithful, that these things bring death and condemnation. For a time I tried to suppress the solemn thoughts with these words conjured up, because sin in the company of my friends still attracted me, and the awareness that I was doing wrong brought such depths of misery that I couldn't bear it, not realizing this was God's way of speaking to me. However, talking to good people, reading the Bible, hearing about someone's sickness or death, many other circumstances kept reminding me of my own impending death and the judgment that would follow. Then I tried to reform by turning from my sins and performing many religious exercises, but I found no relief. For having rejected my former sins, I found myself committing new ones. Even my good deeds were spoiled by sinful elements. So my despair returned. Then I met Faithful, who told me I would never be saved unless I could possess the righteousness of a man who had never sinned. This man, he told me, was Jesus. Faithful also gave me a book and taught me how to pray to God for mercy. I read and prayed for a very long time without finding any release. Then, one day, when I was feeling sadder than ever before, I saw and talked with Jesus, not with my bodily eyes and lips, but with my heart and understanding. He told me to believe, to trust in him with all my heart, and promised that he would receive me, however great my sins, and make me right with God. And then I began to cry out of sheer happiness, for now I understood how God could condemn the sin and justify the sinner. From that moment, I turned in shame and with loathing from my old life, was filled with a longing to live a holy life, serving and loving my new Prince. When Hopeful had finished his story, he and Christian turned around and noticed ignorance still in their wake. So they waited until he had caught up with them. Then, although ignorance made it clear that he didn't really want their company, the pilgrims fell in beside him and tried to draw him into conversation by asking him about his standing before God. Ignorance replied that his goodness must make him acceptable to God. And when Christian challenged this, the lad persisted. Surely a good heart, good thoughts, and a good life are enough to please God. But, countered Christian, thinking you're all these things is not the same as actually having them. Besides, good thoughts and behaviour are only so if they agree with what God says on the matter. And in his book, we read that no one is good. But I'm not bad, protested Ignorance. And I believe that Christ died for sinners, and it is he, by his merits, makes my religious exercises acceptable to God. You have entirely missed the point, exclaimed Christian. It isn't our imperfect obedience that's acceptable to God, it's Christ's perfect obedience. His goodness, accepted by faith, covers all our sins. But that's tantamount to saying, trust Christ and do as you please, protested Ignorance. You're certainly living up to your name, sighed Christian. Can't you understand that saving faith produces love of God's name and his word, his will and his people, so that those who trust him will want to please him? Hopeful then made the point that no one could know God unless he chose to reveal himself to that person. But Ignorance scoffed at the idea of revelation. After that, Christian made one more effort to make the lad understand his true condition, urged him to turn to Jesus, by whose goodness alone he could hope to escape from condemnation. To this, Ignorance replied, "You're going too fast for me. I'll walk behind for a while." With these words, he slowed down, letting Christian and Faithful go on ahead together. As they walked along, the pilgrims talked sadly about the fate of Ignorance and many like him, who thought their own goodness would save them. Such people, they agreed, did from time to time experience conviction of sin. But they stifled their feelings of guilt, not realizing that good could come out of them. At this point in the discussion, Christian was reminded of someone he had met years before. "Did you know a religious man called Temporary?" he asked Hopeful. "Yes, I did," the companion replied. He was a neighbour to Turnback and lived in Graceless Town, 2 miles from Honesty. That's the man, Christian agreed. He began to feel the burden of his sins. I know, Hopeful interposed, for he lived 3 miles from me and often came and wept at my house. I felt sorry for him. Once he told me that he would even be prepared to become a pilgrim, Christian continued. But then he met a man called Save Self, and I heard and saw very little of him after that. Then he asked Hopeful, why do you think it is that some people begin to feel miserable about their sinful state, but don't do anything about it? I think their consciences are touched, said Hopeful, but their minds and wills are unchanged. They fear their punishment, but don't detest their offences. And so, Christian continued, they stop thinking of God, death and judgment as being subjects too painful to dwell on. Next, they stop all private and public practicing of their religion and start avoiding Christians, choosing instead to accompany evil men, whose examples they soon copy. By this time, the pilgrims had completed their journey across the Enchanted Ground, and they arrived at the borders of a country more delightful than any they had ever seen.